Hi, my name is Professor Robbie Wilson. In my last video, I described our new method for identifying talented players using small-sided games. To watch this video, please find this link below. Today, I'll be building on this work by explaining how you can adapt our method to any small-sided game, regardless of the number of players on each side. But before I move on, again, I want to thank our funding and research partners. Thank you in particular to Daniel and all the team at Bahia Football Club. We know that identifying and selecting players can be difficult, sometimes controversial and often stressful. The fate of a young player can be decided based on the opinion of just one coach or scout. And even with the best policies and best intentions, mistakes can be made. Great players can and do miss out on being selected. But even when a coach's decision is correct, players can still feel cheated and parents can become emotional about their child's exclusion because they only see the best in their child. Our method for measuring an individual's quality using small-sided games can help reduce or eliminate some of these problems. But our method was designed and tested using 3 versus 3 small-sided games. So how does one take our 3 versus 3 method and adapt it to other small-sided games? To address this question, I turned to a friend and collaborator of mine, Dr. Charles Foster at the University of Sydney. He's brilliant at these mathematical problems. But before we get to the actual math, I think it's important for us to understand the factors that affect our ability to estimate player quality from games. The first thing to remember is that we are using team games and their results to determine an individual player's quality. So just like in match play, an individual's score depends not just on their own ability, but that of their teammates and their opponents too. So let's review how we measure a player's score. This will help us understand how to adapt our small-sided games to any size. Remember, an individual's quality is their average net team goals per game. We look at every match this individual played to determine their average number of net goals per game. For example, if Ronaldo here plays in this game and his team score 3 goals, and the opposition score 2 goals, then Ronaldo's net score for this game will be plus 1 goals. In fact, both of Ronaldo's teammates also get this same score of plus 1 goals, and each of the opponents will get a score of minus 1 goals. We do this for every one of Ronaldo's games. Here are the data from his first game that I just showed. Sometimes, given his teammates and opponents, he may have scores of -3, seen here in the second game, or -1 goals, here in his third game. But these individual scores are not important. It is his overall score, averaged across many games, that is important. The idea is that a good player is more likely to win more games than a poor player, because the good player's quality will, on average, positively affect the team outcome. In this case, Ronaldo's average net score is plus 1.6 goals per game. This estimate here is based on 15 games. But how many games is enough to determine a player's quality? Clearly, if we get Ronaldo to play 100 games, then we would get a nice, robust, and consistent estimate of his quality. But we don't want to waste our time on 100 games. So if we could get a good estimate of Ronaldo's quality in just 20 games, then we should do that instead. There are 2 main factors that will affect the number of games a player needs to play to get a good estimate of their quality. The number of players on each team and the average number of goals scored in games. Let's first focus on the number of players in a team. This is called the dilution effect. As the number of players increases on a team, the influence of any single player will be diluted. If each player on a team has similar abilities, then in the 3 versus 3 games, each player will have around 1/3 of the influence on that team's performance. But when we play a 7v7 game, then any single player will have around 1/7 of the influence on their team. The individual's influence on a game will become more diluted. The second problem is the number of goals scored during a game. If there are very few goals in a game, then teams that are similar in overall quality will be rarely separated in those games. There may be many draws, making it difficult to pull out the differences in quality between teams, much less individuals. When there are many goals in a game, it is more likely that teams, even those close in quality, will be separated, and there will be far fewer draws. Any method that increases the scoring for teams helps us better rank players as individuals later. So we know the number of players and the number of goals in games will affect how many games are needed to estimate a player's quality. But how many games does one need? This is where Dr. Foster and his simulations come in. Let's go through the results of the model. In running the model, we can assume we have perfect knowledge of each player's quality and then see how many games it would take us to get close to this value under different circumstances. Here we have 40 players. If each player plays only one game, then they would be randomly assigned 2 teammates and play against 3 randomly assigned opponents. Based on this one game only, here is the relationship between a player's actual quality and their estimated quality. There is roughly a positive relationship, but the estimates are often wildly wrong. For example, here we have an individual with an actual quality of -4 goals per game, and our estimated quality is around -15 goals per game. This isn't useful at all. The problem is sometimes an excellent player might be randomly placed with 2 other great players and then play against 3 poor players. In this case, we are likely to overestimate the quality of the players on the good team. Other times, an excellent player may be placed with 2 poor teammates and play against 3 great players. In this case, we are likely to underestimate the quality of the excellent player because his teammates' poor abilities have masked his ability. So what happens when we increase the number of games that each individual plays? Here's the result for 10 games. It is already much better. We can now see a positive relationship between a player's actual quality and their estimated quality. If each player plays 50 games, then we get a very tight relationship indeed. There is still some variation, but it is now a mathematically very reliable estimate of quality. When we get to 100 games, then it is close to perfect. Now let's see what happens to these relationships when we look at 7v7 games. Estimated quality from just one game is completely useless. There is no relationship at all. This is due to the dilution effect. After 10 games, the data are showing some shape, but some individuals with an actual quality of 0 have an estimated quality of 8. Not terribly useful. By the time 50 games are run, then the estimated quality is getting very close to being useful. A nice positive relationship. At 100 simulated games, then the data are very reliable. So now we have an operational model we can then use to simulate games with different numbers of players to see how it affects our estimates of player quality. So here on the x-axis, we have the number of games played. And the y-axis, we have a measure of how close our estimate of quality is to the player's true value. A perfect estimate equals the true quality at a value of 1.0. But we can never really measure true quality, especially using match data, which are complex. Instead, we should aim for an estimate of around 0.8, which is pretty close to true quality and gives us sufficient confidence in the data. Here, in the 3 versus 3 games, you can see how our estimates of player quality improve with number of games. It is around 20 to 25 games that we pass the 0.8 threshold. So 20 to 25 3 versus 3 games would be the minimum number of games we would want to estimate player quality. As we increase the team size, the minimum number of games that need to be played also increases. To accurately estimate player quality, you need a minimum of 30 4 versus 4 games, 40 5 versus 5 games, 60 7v7 games, and close to 100 11 versus 11 games. Our model shows that you can easily use small-sided games up to 7v7 to assess player quality. Above that, the number of games required just isn't practical. The next challenge is to understand how the average score in a game affects our ability to estimate a player's quality. If you are using 5 versus 5 games and the average goal difference between the teams is only around 0.5 goals per game, then you'll need around 60 games to estimate a player's quality. But as the average goal difference between the teams increases to around 1 goal per game, a medium number of goals, or to 2 goals per game, a high number of goals, then you need fewer games, around 40 in this case, to reliably estimate player quality. So, just to recap, we've shown here how you can adapt our method to assess player quality in team sizes up to 7 versus 7. However, you also need to make sure that the average goal difference between teams is high enough to differentiate among them. You can change the number of goals easily by changing the dimensions of the field, the duration of the game, or the size of the goals. If you ensure that teams are playing enough games and that scores are consistently different for different teams, then you can be assured that our method provides robust, repeatable, and consistent measures of player quality. As always, please feel free to email me with your question. Thank you again.